1. The man who woke up in the wrong life. The morning light filtered through unfamiliar curtains as Daniel Langford opened his eyes. Something felt wrong before he even fully regained consciousness. The air smelled different, stale somehow, with an undertone of lavender he didn't recognize. The first thing that struck him was the silence. Living in downtown Chicago meant constant noise, traffic, sirens, the elevated train rattling past his building every 20 minutes. But now, nothing. Just an oppressive, thick silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. He sat up slowly, his heart beginning to race as his eyes adjusted to the room. The bed was larger than his, with expensive-looking sheets in a deep, burgundy color he would never choose. The furniture was all wrong, heavy, dark wood pieces instead of his modern IKEA setup. But it was the photographs that made his blood run cold. They lined the walls in elegant frames. Images of himself, but different. Older. Gray streaked through his hair in these photos. Wrinkles creased the corners of his eyes. And in every picture, there was a woman. Tall, elegant, with long silver hair and green eyes that seemed to pierce straight through the camera. His arm was around her in most shots, both of them smiling like they'd known each other for years. But he had never seen her before in his life. With trembling hands, he reached for his phone on the nightstand. At least that looked like his. The screen lit up, and he nearly dropped it. The date showed October 15th, 2034, 10 years in the future. That's when the messages started flooding in. Ding, ding, ding. One after another from numbers he didn't recognize. Stay inside. Don't leave the house. They're watching. They know you don't belong. Whatever you do, don't look in the basement. The woman in the photos isn't what she seems. His phone showed 47 unread emails, all from an address he didn't recognize. void_walker@null.net. Each subject line was the same. Return to your assigned timeline immediately. Panic rising in his throat. Daniel stumbled to the window. The street outside looked wrong. The houses were similar to what he remembered from his neighborhood, but their proportions were slightly off, like they'd been stretched or compressed. The colors seemed muted, as if someone had drained away part of their vibrancy. A few people walked along the sidewalk, but their movements were too smooth, too coordinated, like actors in a perfectly choreographed play. Then he saw the man in the black suit. He stood perfectly still at the end of the street facing Daniel's house. Even from this distance, Daniel could tell something was terribly wrong with his face. Or rather, a complete absence of one. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin, like an unfinished mannequin. The figure raised one hand and pointed directly at Daniel's window. Terror propelling him forward, Daniel ran from the room. The hallway outside seemed to stretch and contract as he moved, the walls pulsing slightly like they were breathing. Photos lined this corridor too. Hundreds of them now, all showing him with the silver-haired woman. In each successive image, he looked older, more tired, while she remained exactly the same. He took the stairs two at a time, nearly falling as he reached the ground floor. The front door was right there, his escape route. But something made him hesitate, a sound coming from deeper in the house. A familiar voice calling his name. "Danny? Is that you up already?" The silver-haired woman from the photo stepped out of the kitchen. In person, her eyes were even more striking, and completely, utterly black. "You're not supposed to be awake yet," she said, her voice distorting slightly, like a badly tuned radio. "The transition isn't complete." Daniel ran. He burst through the front door into air that felt too thick, like moving through syrup. The colors outside had faded even further, the world now almost monochrome. People on the street stopped to stare as he passed, their faces beginning to smooth over, features melting away until they matched the man in the black suit, who was now standing at every corner, multiplying like a glitch in a video game. Daniel's legs felt heavier with each step as he ducked into an alley. His phone was vibrating constantly now, messages pouring in faster than he could read them. Timeline breach detected. Return to point of origin. Reality collapse imminent. The world around him began to flicker like a fluorescent light about to burn out. Buildings pixelated and reformed. The sky switched from day to night and back in rapid succession. And everywhere he looked, the faceless men were closing in. A hand gripped his shoulder. Inhumanly strong. Impossibly cold. "You don't belong here," the faceless man whispered, his voice somehow coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "This timeline already has a Daniel Langford, and he's much better at being you than you ever were." The world dissolved into static. When Daniel opened his eyes, he was back in his bed. His old bed, in his familiar apartment. Morning traffic buzzed outside. His phone showed the correct date. Everything looked normal, but something felt wrong. Subtly, fundamentally wrong, like a puzzle piece that almost fits, but not quite. His neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had lived next door for 12 years and brought him soup when he had the flu last winter, looked right through him when he said good morning. Her eyes glazed over and she asked, "I'm sorry, who are you?" At work, his desk was there, but his nameplate was missing. His computer login didn't work. His colleagues walked past without acknowledgement, their eyes sliding away from him like oil on water. By evening, his key no longer fit his apartment lock. By midnight, a new tenant was moving in. By morning, no one in the building had ever heard of Daniel Langford. But somewhere, in another timeline, an older version of him lives with a silver-haired woman whose eyes are pools of infinite darkness. They host dinner parties for neighbors with smoothed-over faces. And late at night, he stares at photographs that grow older while she never ages, trying to remember who he used to be. Because some mornings you wake up in the wrong life, and sometimes the wrong life decides to keep you, too. The letters from the previous tenant. Emily Monroe stood in the empty living room of apartment 4B, surrounded by stacked moving boxes and the lingering smell of industrial cleaner. Afternoon sunlight filtered through grimy windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that had seen better days. The real estate agent had called it vintage charm. Emily called it desperately in need of renovation. But the rent was surprisingly affordable for downtown Seattle. And beggars couldn't be choosers when you're starting over in a new city. The landlord, Mr. Chen, had rushed through the lease, signing so quickly she'd barely had time to read it. He was a thin man with nervous eyes who kept glancing at the corners of the room as they talked, as if expecting to see something there. When Emily asked about the previous tenant, he'd mumbled something about a sudden job transfer and practically sprinted down the hallway. The first few days passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. Emily tried to ignore the little oddities. The way the temperature would drop suddenly in certain spots, how the lights seemed to flicker more than they should in a modern building. The strange, scratching sounds that came from inside the walls at night. Old buildings had character, she told herself. That's all it was. Then she found the first letter. She was pulling up a loose floorboard to run an Ethernet cable when she saw it. A yellowed envelope wedged between the boards. The paper was old, but the ink looked fresh, as if it had been written yesterday. On the front, in shaky handwriting, "To whoever lives here. Next." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "If you're reading this, it means they've put someone new in my place. I hope you don't make the same mistakes I did." If you hear knocking from inside the walls, don't answer. Don't try to help them. They're not what they seem. I know how it starts. First the knocking, then the whispers. They'll sound like people you know, maybe your mother, your best friend, a child crying for help. But they're not real. Or maybe they're too real, in a way I still don't understand. I should have left when I first heard them. But I was curious. And they know how to use that curiosity against you. Whatever you do, don't look for old records about this place. Don't try to find out what happened to the others. Knowledge isn't power here. It's an invitation. And if you wake up at 3:33 a.m. to find all your mirrors have turned black, run. Lena. Emily crumpled the letter, trying to laugh it off. Just a prank from some previous tenant, probably trying to scare the newcomer. She tossed it in a drawer and went back to unpacking. That night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., she heard the first knock. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, almost tentative, coming from inside her bedroom wall. Emily pulled her covers tighter, telling herself it was just the pipes. Old buildings made noise. It was normal. Tap, tap, tap. Closer now. More insistent, and then, "Emily, please help, I'm trapped." The voice was muffled but clear, and it sounded exactly like her younger sister Sarah, who had died in a car accident 3 years ago. Emily bolted upright, heart hammering. It couldn't be. She was imagining things. The letter had gotten into her head, and please, it's so dark in here. I can't find my way out. She pressed her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The knocking spread, moving from wall to wall, circling the room like something pacing. More voices joined in, overlapping, pleading, "Let me out! Help us! We're still here. Don't leave us alone in the dark." Emily ran. She didn't even bother changing out of her pajamas, just grabbed her phone and car keys and fled down the 5 flights of stairs to the building manager's apartment. She pounded on his door until a very annoyed Mr. Chen opened up. "The walls," she gasped. "There's something in the walls, and I found this letter." The color drained from his face. "There is no letter," he said flatly. "And nobody has ever lived in that unit before you. Perhaps you should consider breaking your lease." But Emily wasn't going to run. Not yet. She needed answers. The next day, she went to the city library. The archives section was dusty and poorly lit, but the librarian was helpful. Too helpful. Almost eager to share what she knew about the building. "Oh, the Blackwood Apartments," she said, pulling out stacks of old newspapers. "Such a fascinating history, though you might not want to read too much about your particular unit." Emily spent hours poring over microfiche and yellowed papers. The building had been constructed in 1963, and apartment 4B had been occupied continuously since then. But something was wrong with the records. Tenants would appear in the building's documentation, stay for exactly 10 years, and then vanish completely. No forwarding address, no death certificate, nothing. They simply ceased to exist. And every single one had reported the same things. Knocking in the walls, voices calling out to them, letters appearing and disappearing beneath the floorboards. The most recent case was Lena Carter, who had disappeared 20 years ago. The police report included a transcript of her final phone call to her mother. "They're in the walls, Mom. But they're not just in the walls. They are the walls. The building, it's alive. It's hungry. And I think I finally understand what it wants." That was the last anyone had heard from her. Emily's hands shook as she read the article's date, October 15th, exactly 20 years ago today. When she returned to her apartment that evening, something felt different. The air was heavier, charged with static electricity that made her hair stand on end. And there was a new letter on her kitchen counter, one she knew she hadn't left there. Dear Emily, now you know. I'm sorry. Knowledge really is an invitation here. But maybe you can do what I couldn't. Inside the walls, time works differently. 20 years for you has been like 20 minutes for us. Yes, us. All of us. Every tenant who ever disappeared from 4B. We're still here, trapped in the spaces between, in the dark behind your walls. The building keeps us, feeds on us, uses our voices to lure the next ones in. Every 10 years, it needs a new tenant. Someone to take the place of those it has already claimed. And your 10 years are about to begin. But you have one advantage I never had. You know what's coming. And knowledge, despite what I said before, can be power, if you know how to use it. Look for the Black Mirror at 3:33. Don't run from it. Look into it. Really look. You'll see us. And maybe, just maybe, you can find a way to break the cycle. Lena. That night, Emily waited. The knocking started right on schedule, but this time, she didn't run. She watched as, one by one, every mirror in her apartment turned black as pitch. At exactly 3:33 a.m., she saw them. Faces in the darkness behind the glass, dozens of them, pressed against some invisible barrier like people trapped underwater. Young, old, from different eras, but all bearing the same desperate expression. And they were trying to tell her something. Emily pressed her hand against the mirror's surface. It was warm, pulsing, like a heartbeat. The glass rippled under her touch. Behind her, the walls began to crack. 3. The hiker without a face. The search team found Josh Redding's backpack on a Tuesday morning. It sat perfectly upright beside a small stream in the Pine Barrens of Vermont, miles from any marked trail. Everything inside was untouched. His phone still had battery, his water bottle was full, his trail mix unopened. Even his jacket was folded neatly beside it, without a single wrinkle. The only strange things were his 3 compasses, all spinning wildly like pinwheels in a storm. For 5 days, search and rescue combed the dense forest. Helicopters swept overhead, dogs were brought in, but they would reach a certain point and sit down, whining, refusing to go further. Then, on the 6th day, Josh walked out of the forest. The search team spotted him first, a solitary figure emerging from the tree line at exactly 6:33 a.m. There was a moment of relief, of celebration. Then someone screamed. Because the thing that walked out of the woods wasn't quite Josh anymore. It moved like him, wore his clothes, was his exact height and build. But where his face should have been, there was only smooth, unbroken skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank canvas of flesh, as if someone had erased his features with a cosmic pencil. His girlfriend Maria ran to him, calling his name. He turned toward her voice, but his movements were wrong, too fluid, like a puppet on invisible strings. When she touched him, his skin was ice cold and felt like polished marble. He stood there, unmoving, as park rangers radioed for help. For hours he remained still, head cocked slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Medical personnel drew blood. It was black and thick like tar. His heartbeat followed a pattern that human hearts shouldn't be able to maintain. Just before sunset, he finally moved. His hand reached up too smoothly, too precisely, and touched Maria's cheek. Then he turned and walked back into the forest. Rangers tried to follow, but the moment Josh crossed the tree line, he vanished. Not gradually, not running away. He simply ceased to exist between one step and the next. A week later, a hiker found a camera in the underbrush. Most of the footage was corrupted, but they recovered 3 clips. First, Josh walking, narrating his hike. Day's getting foggy, but the fall colors are incredible. Compasses are acting weird, though. The camera panned, catching something tall and pale between the trees, a figure with impossibly long limbs and too many joints. Second, Josh, standing still, camera pointed down. A shadow fell across him, a shadow that didn't match any natural shape. His voice shaking. They're here. They've always been here. We just couldn't see them before. The final clip was 3 seconds long. It showed Josh's face, normal and human, as he whispered, "They want to wear us." Since then, 6 more hikers have vanished in the same section of forest. 3 have returned, all without faces, all moving with that unnatural grace, all disappearing back into the woods by sunset. The pine barrens are closed now, but sometimes on foggy mornings, people driving past see figures emerging from the tree line. They walk with fluid, perfect grace, and where their faces should be. The locals have learned not to look too closely, not to stop when they see someone walking along the forest road, no matter how familiar they might seem. Because the things that wear our faces aren't always content to stay in the woods. Last week, Maria filed a missing persons report. Her neighbor, a man she'd known for years, had started moving strangely. Too smoothly. Too perfectly. And this morning when she saw him checking his mail, she could have sworn that for just a moment, in the right light, his face wasn't quite there. The search for Josh Redding remains open. His case number is one of dozens pinned to a board in the ranger station. But the rangers don't search anymore. They've learned that some parts of the forest don't want to be found. Sometimes, late at night, hikers report hearing voices in the woods. They sound like calls for help, like lost people trying to find their way home. But if you listen carefully, the voices are wrong. They're too perfect, too practiced, like something that learned human speech from reading a manual. And they're getting closer to the trails every year.